My name is Sergeant Major Kane Blackwood of the 15th Cardian Heavy Infantry, and I spent 8 months as a captive of Scardraw before managing to escape during a chaotic assault on an Imperial hive city. Those 8 months taught me that there are forms of brutality that exist beyond the structured cruelties of chaos or the calculated torments of the Dark Eldar. There is the raw, primal savagery of creatures whose entire existence revolves around violence for its own sake, beings who have elevated warfare from necessity to religion and treat captured enemies as entertainment rather than strategic assets. I had served in the Imperial Guard for 17 years, fighting against rebel PDF forces, chaos cultists, and minor xenos incursions across 4 different sectors. My unit had earned commendations for valor in 3 major campaigns and maintained a reputation for tactical competence that made us a preferred choice for challenging deployments. I believe that my experience with various forms of warfare had prepared me to handle any enemy the galaxy might produce. But nothing in my military background had equipped me to understand the psychological reality of being captured by creatures whose approach to violence was fundamentally different from any human conception of warfare. The Orks didn't treat us as prisoners of war, intelligence sources, or bargaining chips. We were toys, entertainment devices that could provide amusement through our suffering while serving various practical functions within their society of perpetual violence. The capture occurred during what should have been a routine patrol mission near the contested world of Mordheim 7, where intelligence reports had indicated minor Ork raiding activity that posed no significant threat to our primary defensive positions. Our patrol was designed to gather reconnaissance about Ork numbers and equipment while demonstrating Imperial presence in the disputed territory. The ambush that claimed my squad was not the result of sophisticated tactical planning, but rather the opportunistic violence that characterizes all Ork behavior. A mob of Ork boys had been conducting their own patrol of the area, looking for anything they could fight or loot when they encountered our reconnaissance team. The resulting engagement was brief and decisive, as our small unit was overwhelmed by enemies whose enthusiasm for combat exceeded any concern for casualties. The Orks who captured us displayed a casual approach to violence that was more disturbing than the calculated cruelties I had observed in other enemies. They killed 3 of my men simply because those soldiers had been wounded during the firefight and were making too much noise. They kept the rest of us alive, not from mercy or strategic consideration, but because living prisoners provided more entertainment opportunities than corpses. The transport to the main Ork encampment was conducted with the same chaotic efficiency that characterized all aspects of Ork society. Crude but effective methods applied with complete disregard for prisoner welfare or survival. We were loaded onto ramshackle vehicles that had been constructed from salvaged Imperial equipment and Ork engineering, creating mechanical monstrosities that barely qualified as functional transportation. The vehicles themselves were torture devices, designed with no consideration for passenger comfort and modified with additional features that seemed intended primarily to cause suffering. Restraint systems that used barbed wire and scrap metal to secure prisoners in place, seating arrangements that forced uncomfortable positions for extended periods, and exhaust systems that filled passenger compartments with toxic fumes. During the journey, we were subjected to the casual sadism that seemed to be the default mode of interaction for Ork society. Our captors would periodically beat us for entertainment, conduct crude medical experiments to test human pain responses, or force us to fight each other for their amusement. These activities were not systematic torture, but spontaneous violence driven by boredom and opportunity. The Ork guards treated us with the same attention they might give to livestock or equipment, functional resources that required minimal maintenance to preserve their utility. We were fed scraps of unidentifiable meat that might have come from any source, given water that had been contaminated with various chemicals, and provided no medical attention for injuries sustained during capture or transport. But perhaps most disturbing was the recognition that our captors were genuinely enjoying themselves throughout the journey. The Orks found our fear and suffering genuinely entertaining, not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. They laughed at our discomfort, made crude jokes about our situation, and competed with each other to devise new forms of casual cruelty. The journey provided my first glimpse into the social dynamics of Ork society, revealing that violence was not just their primary method of problem-solving, but their primary form of entertainment, social interaction, and cultural expression. They lived in a constant state of low-level aggression that could escalate to lethal violence at any moment, treating brutality as a normal part of daily existence. The main Ork encampment was a sprawling settlement that defied every principle of military organization and urban planning. A chaotic collection of structures that had been built according to no apparent logic beyond immediate functional necessity. Buildings were constructed from salvaged materials using engineering principles that seemed to operate more on enthusiasm than physics, creating an environment that was simultaneously impressive and terrifying. The encampment's layout reflected the Ork social hierarchy, with larger and more heavily fortified structures belonging to the most powerful Orks, while smaller and more precarious buildings housed the rank-and-file boys. But the hierarchy itself was fluid and violent, constantly changing based on the outcomes of fights, challenges, and demonstrations of superior brutality. The Orks, who inhabited this settlement, represented every subspecies and specialization within their species, from the massive Nobs, who commanded through superior violence, to the specialized mechs, who created weapons and vehicles using principles that human science could not explain. Each group had its own particular approach to brutality and its own specific uses for human prisoners. The settlement's economy was based entirely on violence and the products of violence: weapons, armor, vehicles, and slaves captured from various enemy species. Trade negotiations were conducted through physical confrontation, property disputes were resolved through combat, and social status was determined by the ability to inflict or withstand violence. Human prisoners served multiple functions within this economy, providing labor for dangerous tasks, subjects for crude medical and technical experiments, entertainment through gladiatorial combat, and food when other sources became scarce. Our value was determined not by our skills or knowledge, but by our capacity to provide entertainment through our suffering. The Ork approach to prisoner management was characteristically chaotic, with different groups claiming ownership of various humans based on whoever could physically maintain control over them. This system created ongoing conflicts between different Ork factions that sometimes provided opportunities for prisoners to escape during the resulting violence. Within the Ork encampment, a complex social hierarchy determined the treatment that different prisoners received and the specific forms of abuse they would experience. Understanding this hierarchy was essential for survival, as it determined which Orks had the authority to kill prisoners and which ones could be safely resisted or manipulated. At the apex of the hierarchy were the Nobs, massive Orks whose authority derived from their superior capacity for violence and their ability to intimidate other Orks through demonstrations of brutality. These individuals treated human prisoners as personal property, using them for entertainment, labor, and occasional consumption depending on their current needs and moods. The Nobs competed constantly with each other for status and resources, engaging in elaborate displays of cruelty designed to demonstrate their creativity and commitment to violence. Human prisoners often became the focal points of these competitions, as Nobs would attempt to devise increasingly extreme forms of torture or degradation to impress their peers. Below the Nobs were the various specialists who provided essential services to the Ork community: mechs, who built weapons and vehicles, pain boys, who provided crude medical services, and weird boys, who channeled psychic energy for various purposes. Each specialist group had its own particular uses for human prisoners that reflected their professional interests. The mechs used prisoners as test subjects for experimental weapons and vehicles, conducting trials that were designed to evaluate equipment performance rather than ensure subject survival. The pain boys practiced surgical techniques on human subjects, viewing our different physiology as an interesting challenge that could improve their medical skills. The rank-and-file boys treated prisoners according to their individual inclinations and current entertainment needs. resulting in treatment that ranged from casual indifference to extreme sadism, depending on the specific orc and the circumstances of any given encounter. But perhaps most disturbing was the recognition that even the lowest-ranking orcs possessed absolute authority over human prisoners, creating situations where our survival depended on the whims of creatures whose decision-making processes were driven entirely by immediate impulses rather than any form of rational consideration. The Orks had developed numerous games and entertainments that used human prisoners as participants, competitions that provided amusement for Orc audiences while serving various practical functions within their society. These games were not systematic torture, but spontaneous violence elevated to the level of cultural activity. Gladiatorial combat was the most common form of prisoner entertainment, with humans forced to fight each other or various creatures that the Orcs had captured for sporting purposes. These fights were not conducted according to any formal rules, but simply continued until one participant was dead or too injured to provide further amusement. The combat scenarios were designed to maximize entertainment value rather than demonstrate fighting skill, often involving mismatched opponents, improvised weapons, and environmental hazards that made survival a matter of luck rather than competence. The Orcs found these unequal contests more amusing than fair fights, preferring spectacles that involved creativity and surprise. Racing competitions involved prisoners being forced to operate dangerous vehicles or navigate hazardous obstacle courses for Orc entertainment, with mechanical failures and environmental dangers providing the primary sources of excitement. The Orcs were less interested in who won these races than in the spectacular accidents and injuries that occurred during competition. Hunting games used human prisoners as prey for Orc hunting parties, providing opportunities for Orcs to practice their tracking and combat skills while ensuring that the quarry would provide interesting resistance. These hunts often lasted for days, with prisoners given minimal equipment and head starts that were calculated to provide optimal entertainment duration. Construction competitions forced prisoners to build structures or devices according to Orc specifications, with failure resulting in immediate execution and success resulting in assignment to more dangerous construction projects. These competitions served practical purposes while providing entertainment through prisoner suffering. The most elaborate games involved complex scenarios that combined multiple forms of violence and entertainment, often lasting for weeks and involving dozens of prisoners in interconnected challenges that provided ongoing amusement for different Orc audiences. The Orc approach to violence was fundamentally different from human warfare, representing not just a military tactic or survival strategy, but a religious and cultural practice that provided meaning and structure to their entire civilization. Understanding this difference was crucial for recognizing why normal human psychological defenses were inadequate for dealing with Orc captivity. Violence served as the Orc equivalent of art, philosophy, religion, and entertainment, providing spiritual fulfillment that other species might derive from creative or intellectual pursuits. The Orcs found genuine beauty in brutality, aesthetic satisfaction in destruction, and spiritual meaning in the infliction of suffering. This cultural commitment to violence created a society where cruelty was not an aberration, but the natural expression of proper social behavior, where individuals were expected to demonstrate their worth through their capacity for inflicting pain and destruction. Kindness or mercy were viewed as forms of weakness that indicated unfitness for survival. The Orc understanding of honor and respect was entirely based on capacity for violence, with social status determined by the ability to defeat opponents in combat and maintain authority through intimidation. This created a constantly shifting hierarchy where any display of weakness could result in immediate replacement by more violent competitors. The religious aspects of Orc violence included rituals and ceremonies that incorporated brutality as forms of worship, practices that provided spiritual significance to activities that other species would consider simply sadistic. These rituals often used human prisoners as sacrificial subjects, treating our suffering as offerings to their violent deities. The cultural transmission of violence occurred through storytelling, games, and social interactions that celebrated brutality while teaching young orcs the proper methods for inflicting suffering. Human prisoners often served as educational aids in these cultural activities, providing opportunities for demonstration and practice. The orcs who held us captive represented a form of consciousness that was fundamentally alien to human psychology, minds that had evolved to find genuine pleasure in activities that would traumatize most sentient species. Understanding this alien psychology was essential for predicting orc behavior and identifying opportunities for survival or escape. The orc capacity for empathy was virtually non-existent, not because they were incapable of understanding suffering, but because they viewed suffering as entertainment rather than something to be prevented or alleviated. They could recognize pain and fear in their prisoners, but these recognitions triggered amusement rather than compassion. Their decision-making processes were driven primarily by immediate impulses rather than long-term planning, creating unpredictable behavior patterns that could shift from casual indifference to lethal violence within seconds. This impulsiveness made it impossible to develop reliable strategies for managing orc interactions. The social dynamics of orc psychology included constant competition for status and resources that manifested as ongoing, low-level aggression between individuals, creating an environment where violence could escalate unexpectedly during routine interactions. Human prisoners often became casualties of these internal orc conflicts. The orc understanding of humor was entirely based on the suffering of others, with amusement derived from witnessing pain, fear, humiliation, and degradation. This created social situations where human prisoners were expected to provide entertainment through their misery, with failure to be sufficiently amusing resulting in increased abuse. Their intellectual curiosity was limited to topics related to violence and destruction, with genuine interest in human physiology, psychology, and behavior only insofar as this knowledge could be used to inflict more effective torture or devise more entertaining forms of abuse. The orc capacity for boredom created dangerous situations for prisoners, as unstimulated orcs would often resort to casual violence as a form of entertainment when no other activities were available. Managing orc boredom became a crucial survival skill that required constantly providing new forms of amusement. The extended period of captivity created systematic degradation of human dignity and identity that was perhaps more damaging than the physical abuse, psychological torture that attacked the fundamental concepts of selfhood and moral agency that define human consciousness. The constant exposure to arbitrary violence created a state of hypervigilance that made normal rest or relaxation impossible. Chronic stress that gradually wore down physical and mental resilience while making every moment of existence a potential crisis requiring immediate response. The unpredictable nature of orc behavior made it impossible to develop effective survival strategies or psychological defenses, creating learned helplessness that gradually eroded the sense of personal agency and self-efficacy that had sustained me through previous military challenges. The social isolation from other humans, combined with constant exposure to alien psychology, created a form of cultural or disorientation that made it difficult to maintain connection with human values and perspectives. The orc worldview began to seem normal simply through constant exposure. The degrading treatment designed to reduce prisoners to subhuman status gradually affected self-perception and identity, creating internal psychological changes that persisted even when external circumstances provided temporary relief from abuse. The constant threat of death or torture created a psychological state where survival became the only meaningful goal, gradually eroding other values and priorities that had previously provided structure and meaning to existence. The witnessing of atrocities committed against other prisoners created survivor guilt and moral injury that contaminated memories of human relationships and experiences, making it difficult to maintain faith in human dignity or the value of individual life. The orc encampment operated as a complete ecosystem where suffering served multiple functions within their society, creating sustainable systems for generating and maintaining human misery while supporting various aspects of orc culture and economy. Human prisoners provided labor for dangerous construction and maintenance tasks that Orks considered too boring or insufficiently violent to perform themselves, creating a workforce that could be literally worked to death without affecting the overall productivity of Ork society. The entertainment value of prisoner suffering supported social cohesion within Ork communities, providing shared experiences and cultural activities that strengthened group identity while reinforcing their commitment to violence as a way of life. Medical experimentation using human subjects provided practical knowledge about anatomy and physiology that improved Ork military effectiveness, while the experimental process itself served as a form of entertainment that satisfied their curiosity about causing pain. The psychological effects of maintaining human prisoners provided Orks with ongoing opportunities to exercise their capacity for cruelty, ensuring that their sadistic skills remained sharp through constant practice on available subjects. The threat of prisoner treatment served as psychological warfare against other human forces, with escaped prisoners spreading information about Ork brutality that could demoralize enemy troops and reduce their willingness to fight rather than surrender. The trading and ownership of prisoners created economic relationships between different Ork groups, with human captives serving as a form of currency that could be exchanged for weapons, equipment, or services within the broader Ork economy. Within the prisoner population, a complex hierarchy developed that determined survival chances and treatment quality based on factors that often seemed arbitrary but actually reflected the specific preferences and needs of different Ork groups. Military personnel like myself were valued for our combat experience and tactical knowledge, making us useful for training purposes and gladiatorial entertainment while providing information that could improve Ork military effectiveness against Imperial forces. Technical specialists were preserved for their knowledge of Imperial equipment and technology, serving as forced consultants for Ork mechs who wanted to understand how to maintain or modify captured Imperial gear for their own purposes. Medical personnel were particularly valued by pain boys who used them as assistants in surgical procedures while learning about human medical techniques that might be applicable to Ork physiology. Civilians often received the worst treatment because they provided no practical value beyond entertainment, making them expendable resources that could be consumed casually without affecting the overall utility of the prisoner population. Women prisoners faced additional dangers related to Ork curiosity about human reproduction and social dynamics, though Ork psychology was too alien for these interests to take forms that human psychology could predict or prepare for. Children were often treated as curiosities rather than threats, receiving treatment that could range from casual indifference to extreme brutality depending on the whims of individual Orks and their current entertainment needs. The social dynamics between prisoners created additional hierarchies based on perceived usefulness, survival skills, and willingness to collaborate with Ork demands, generating internal conflicts that served Ork interests by preventing organized resistance. My psychological breaking point occurred during my 4th month of captivity, when the accumulated effects of constant violence, arbitrary brutality, and systematic dehumanization had eroded my mental resilience to the point where continued resistance seemed both impossible and meaningless. The specific incident involved being forced to participate in gladiatorial combat against another Imperial Guard prisoner, a corporal from my own regiment who had been captured in a different engagement. The Orks had arranged this fight specifically to maximize the entertainment value of watching former comrades attempt to kill each other. The combat was conducted in an improvised arena surrounded by cheering Orks who provided commentary and encouragement while placing bets on the outcome. The weapons were crude and inadequate, designed to prolong the fight rather than enable quick victories that might reduce the entertainment value. The psychological pressure of fighting someone I had served alongside, combined with the knowledge that one of us would die for Ork amusement, created a form of moral injury that exceeded anything I had experienced during my military career. The situation forced choices that violated fundamental human values while providing no alternative that preserved dignity or integrity. The fight lasted for over an hour, with both participants attempting to minimize damage to each other while providing sufficient spectacle to satisfy our audience. But the Orks eventually became impatient with our reluctance to inflict serious injuries and began throwing additional weapons into the arena. The eventual outcome involved the death of someone who had been both a colleague and a friend. Killed not in honorable combat defending Imperial interests, but in degrading spectacle designed to amuse creatures whose understanding of honor was completely alien to human moral frameworks. The psychological impact of this experience was compounded by the Ork response, which treated the death as successful entertainment while showing no recognition of the human cost involved. Their casual disposal of the body and immediate planning for future fights demonstrated the complete devaluation of human life that characterized their society. Developing effective survival strategies under Ork captivity required abandoning normal human approaches to conflict resolution and adopting methods that could work within their alien psychological framework while preserving whatever remained of human dignity and identity. The primary survival strategy involved becoming sufficiently entertaining to individual Orks that they would protect their investment in your continued existence, providing value that exceeded the immediate satisfaction they might derive from killing you. This required understanding each Ork's particular interests and preferences. Physical survival required learning to endure various forms of abuse without sustaining injuries that would reduce your entertainment value, developing pain tolerance and recovery capabilities that could maintain functionality under conditions of ongoing brutality. Psychological survival involved maintaining internal mental structures that could preserve human identity and values, despite constant exposure to alien psychology and systematic attempts to reduce prisoners to subhuman status through degrading treatment. Social survival within the prisoner population required careful navigation of competing interests and survival strategies, building alliances that could provide mutual protection while avoiding conflicts that might attract negative Ork attention. The development of useful skills that interested specific Orks could provide temporary protection and improved treatment, particularly technical abilities that could help maintain Ork equipment or medical knowledge that could assist painboy procedures. Understanding Ork social dynamics was essential for predicting dangerous situations and identifying opportunities to exploit conflicts between different Ork groups, though such exploitation required extreme caution to avoid becoming caught in the middle of violent disputes. The cultivation of entertainment value through storytelling, demonstrations of human customs, or other cultural activities could provide distractions that reduced Ork boredom while buying time to develop more substantial survival strategies. The opportunity for escape occurred during a chaotic assault on an Imperial hive city, when the Ork encampment was mobilized for war and security attention was focused on preparing for combat rather than managing prisoners. The confusion and excitement of impending battle created vulnerabilities in their normally overwhelming security measures. The assault preparation involved loading prisoners onto transport vehicles to serve various functions during the attack, some as forced labor for construction and maintenance tasks, others as expendable troops for dangerous advance missions, and many as entertainment during the campaign. The transport convoy was attacked by Imperial forces conducting a spoiling attack designed to disrupt Ork preparations, creating a running battle that provided cover for escape attempts while Ork attention was focused on the immediate combat situation rather than prisoner security. During the battle, several transport vehicles were destroyed or damaged, creating chaos that allowed some prisoners to escape their restraints and flee into the surrounding terrain. The Orks were too engaged in fighting Imperial forces to immediately pursue escaped prisoners. The escape required abandoning other prisoners who could not break free from their restraints, moral choices that created lasting guilt but were necessary for any successful escape attempt under the circumstances. These decisions represented the kind of moral compromise that captivity situations inevitably force upon survivors. The immediate aftermath of escape involved evading Ork pursuit parties while navigating hostile terrain without adequate supplies or equipment, survival challenges that were complicated by injuries sustained during captivity and the psychological trauma of extended imprisonment. Contact with Imperial forces required convincing them that I was a legitimate escapee rather than a potential security threat. verification procedures that were complicated by the physical and psychological changes that months of captivity had created. The immediate aftermath of escape was characterized by medical and psychological evaluations that revealed the extent of physical and mental damage that 8 months of Ork captivity had inflicted, injuries that would require extensive treatment and rehabilitation. The physical damage included chronic injuries from repeated beatings, malnutrition effects that had compromised multiple organ systems, and exposure to toxic substances that had created ongoing health problems requiring long-term medical monitoring. The psychological trauma manifested as hypervigilance, paranoid reactions to sudden movements or loud noises, and difficulty sleeping due to recurring nightmares about captivity experiences. These symptoms were consistent with severe post-traumatic stress that would require extensive therapeutic intervention. The social readjustment challenges included difficulty relating to other humans after extended exposure to alien psychology, problems with normal social interactions that seemed trivial compared to survival situations, and ongoing guilt about survival when so many fellow prisoners had died. The intelligence debriefing process provided valuable information about Ork society, military capabilities, and operational methods that could benefit future Imperial military operations against similar threats. This intelligence gathering was the only positive outcome that could be derived from the captivity experience. The medical evaluations revealed that extended exposure to Ork society had created psychological changes that might persist indefinitely, alterations to personality and worldview that could not be completely reversed through therapy or rehabilitation. The return to military service required extensive evaluation to determine fitness for duty and appropriate assignment to roles that could accommodate the psychological changes created by the captivity experience. The most enduring aspect of Ork captivity is the recognition that such experiences fundamentally alter human psychology in ways that persist long after physical escape from the immediate threat, creating permanent changes to personality and worldview that affect all subsequent experiences and relationships. The constant exposure to arbitrary violence created a persistent state of hypervigilance that makes it difficult to relax or feel secure, even in objectively safe environments. Ongoing stress responses that were adaptive during captivity but become maladaptive in normal social situations. The psychological adaptation to alien moral frameworks created ongoing confusion about human values and social norms, making it difficult to readjust to Imperial society and maintain the relationships and commitments that provide meaning and structure to normal human existence. The survival strategies that proved effective during captivity often involved moral compromises that create lasting guilt and self-doubt. Internal conflicts that persist long after the situations that necessitated those compromises have ended. The witnessing of extreme brutality created a form of moral injury that affects the ability to maintain faith in human dignity and the value of individual life, philosophical challenges that undermine the foundations of normal social and ethical functioning. The knowledge gained about the true nature of Ork society creates ongoing awareness of threats that most Imperial citizens never have to confront. Information that makes it difficult to maintain the optimism and hope that enable normal psychological functioning. The recognition that survival often depends on factors beyond individual control creates a sense of powerlessness and vulnerability that affects all subsequent decision-making and risk assessment, making it difficult to engage in normal activities that involve any element of danger or uncertainty. This testimony serves as a warning about the specific nature of Ork captivity and the psychological challenges that such experiences create for survivors. Information that may prove crucial for understanding how to prevent, resist, or recover from similar situations. Imperial forces facing potential Ork capture should understand that surrender or capture by these aliens represents a fate that may be worse than death in battle, as Ork treatment of prisoners is designed to maximize suffering rather than serve any strategic or practical purpose. The psychological preparation for potential Ork encounter should include understanding that their approach to violence is fundamentally different from human warfare, representing cultural and religious practices rather than military tactics, making normal psychological defenses inadequate for dealing with their brutality. The survival strategies that prove effective in other captivity situations may be counterproductive when dealing with orcs, whose alien psychology requires different approaches that prioritize entertainment value over resistance or non-cooperation. The recovery from orc captivity requires specialized therapeutic approaches that account for the unique psychological challenges created by exposure to alien moral frameworks and systematic dehumanization techniques that exceed normal human experience. The intelligence value of orc captivity survivors should be recognized and utilized to improve Imperial understanding of enemy capabilities and methods, while providing appropriate support for the psychological consequences of gathering such information. The broader implications of orc psychological warfare should be considered when developing military strategies and personnel policies, recognizing that the mere threat of capture can affect troop morale and combat effectiveness. The experience of orc captivity provides insight into the fundamental nature of the threats that humanity faces in the galaxy, revealing that some enemies represent not just military challenges, but existential threats to human psychology and civilization itself. The orc approach to violence represents a form of alien culture that is completely incompatible with human values and cannot be negotiated with, accommodated, or understood through normal diplomatic or cultural exchange. These are enemies that must be completely defeated rather than managed or contained. The psychological warfare aspects of orc society extend beyond immediate battlefield effects to include long-term impacts on human survivors and civilian populations, creating forms of trauma that can affect entire generations and compromise the social cohesion necessary for effective resistance. The systematic nature of orc brutality suggests that their threat to humanity extends beyond military conquest to encompass cultural destruction, the elimination of human values and social structures through exposure to alien moral frameworks that are fundamentally hostile to human psychology. The recovery and rehabilitation challenges faced by orc captivity survivors reveal gaps in Imperial medical and psychological support systems, indicating needs for specialized treatment approaches that can address the unique challenges created by exposure to alien brutality. The intelligence-gathering opportunities presented by orc captivity survivors should be systematically exploited to improve Imperial understanding of enemy capabilities while developing more effective strategies for prevention, resistance, and recovery. The most important lesson learned through my captivity experience is that some threats to humanity cannot be understood or addressed through normal military or diplomatic approaches, requiring recognition that certain enemies represent absolute incompatibility with human existence and values. The orcs do not simply want to defeat humanity or exploit human resources. They want to transform human beings into entertainment devices for their own amusement, reducing our species to the status of prey in a cosmic hunting preserve operated for their cultural and religious satisfaction. This fundamental incompatibility means that compromise, negotiation, or coexistence with orc society is impossible, and that humanity's survival depends on our ability to completely eliminate this threat rather than simply managing or containing it. The psychological challenges faced by survivors of orc captivity represent a preview of what would await all of humanity if these aliens achieved significant territorial or population control, indicating that this is not just a military threat, but an existential challenge to human consciousness itself. The courage required to face such threats comes not from confidence in victory, but from recognition that some things are worth defending even when the costs of defense seem prohibitive, that human dignity and values must be preserved regardless of the price required for their protection. The Emperor protects those who protect themselves through courage, vigilance, and the determination to resist threats that seek not just our destruction, but our transformation into something that no longer deserves the name human. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and some of that war is fought not just for territory or resources, but for the right to remain human in the face of enemies whose very existence represents an assault on human nature itself. This is what it means to be captured by orcs, to discover that evil can take forms that exceed human imagination, that brutality can become culture, and that survival sometimes requires accepting that death is preferable to the alternatives that await those who fall into alien hands. Remember Sergeant Major Kane Blackwood not as a man who was broken by captivity, but as a soldier who maintained his humanity despite 8 months in hell, designed to transform human beings into something else entirely. In that resistance lies whatever hope remains for our species when faced with enemies that seek not just our conquest, but our corruption. The first hours of Ork captivity were characterized by a form of psychological disorientation that exceeded anything my military training had prepared me to handle. The complete abandonment of human concepts of warfare, prisoner treatment, and basic social interaction created a reality so alien that my mind struggled to process what was happening around me. The Orks who had captured us displayed no interest in interrogation, strategic intelligence, or the conventional purposes that drive prisoner-taking in human warfare. Instead, they seemed primarily motivated by curiosity about human physiology and psychology, treating us like interesting specimens that could provide entertainment through various forms of experimentation. Their casual approach to extreme violence was perhaps more disturbing than systematic torture would have been. An Ork might casually break a prisoner's arm to see how humans react to pain, or force captives to perform degrading acts simply because the results seemed amusing. This violence was not driven by anger, hatred, or strategic purpose. It was recreational activity pursued for its own sake. The language barrier initially prevented understanding of Ork intentions or communications, but their body language and behavior patterns made it clear that we were considered property rather than prisoners. They handled us with the same casual ownership that humans might display toward livestock, checking our condition and discussing our potential uses without any recognition that we possessed consciousness or dignity worth respecting. The physical conditions of captivity were brutal but not systematically designed for maximum suffering. The Orks simply had no concept of prisoner welfare, providing whatever minimal resources were necessary to keep us alive while remaining completely indifferent to comfort, hygiene, or psychological well-being. The social dynamics among our captors revealed that even prisoner ownership was subject to the violent competition that characterized all aspects of Ork society. Different Orks would claim ownership of specific prisoners based on who could physically maintain control, leading to fights that sometimes resulted in prisoner deaths as collateral damage. As days passed in captivity, I began to understand that survival required learning to navigate Ork psychology and social dynamics, despite how alien and incomprehensible their thought processes initially appeared. This learning process was complicated by the fact that Ork behavior patterns were fundamentally different from human logic and could not be predicted using normal psychological models. The Orks operated according to immediate impulses rather than long-term planning, making their actions unpredictable but also creating opportunities for prisoners who could understand and exploit their impulsive nature. An Ork might become fascinated by a particular human behavior or characteristic, providing temporary protection for prisoners who could maintain that interest. Their social hierarchy was fluid and violent, constantly changing based on the outcomes of challenges and demonstrations of superior brutality. Understanding which Ork currently held authority over specific prisoners was essential for survival, as appealing to the wrong individual could result in immediate punishment or death. The Ork concept of entertainment was entirely based on witnessing suffering, competition, or violence, but their preferences for specific types of entertainment varied between individuals and could change rapidly based on mood or circumstances. Learning to provide the right kind of entertainment to specific Orks became a crucial survival skill. Their attention spans were generally short, meaning that prisoners needed to constantly find new ways to remain interesting or useful to avoid being discarded when novelty wore off. This created ongoing pressure to develop new skills, behaviors, or entertainment value that could maintain Ork interest. The communication barrier gradually diminished as I learned basic Ork vocabulary and speech patterns, though their language reflected their violent worldview in ways that made normal conversation impossible. Every interaction was conducted in terms of dominance, submission, violence, or entertainment. The psychological impact of Ork captivity was cumulative, with each day adding new layers of trauma and dehumanization that gradually eroded mental resilience and hope. The arbitrary nature of Ork violence made it impossible to develop effective coping strategies or maintain any sense of personal agency. The constant threat of sudden death or mutilation created chronic stress that affected every aspect of psychological functioning, making sleep difficult, concentration impossible, and emotional regulation increasingly challenging. The knowledge that survival depended entirely on the whims of creatures whose decision-making processes were completely alien created a sense of helplessness that pervaded every moment of existence. The witnessing of atrocities committed against fellow prisoners created a form of moral injury that was perhaps more damaging than personal physical abuse. Being forced to watch other humans being tortured, killed, or degraded for Ork entertainment while being unable to help or intervene created guilt and trauma that persisted long after specific incidents had ended. The social isolation from normal human contact, combined with constant exposure to alien psychology, created a gradual erosion of human identity and values. The Ork worldview began to seem normal through constant exposure, while human concepts of dignity, morality, and purpose became increasingly abstract and difficult to maintain. The physical degradation that accompanied extended captivity, malnutrition, untreated injuries, exposure to toxic substances, and constant physical stress created a downward spiral that affected mental as well as physical functioning. The body's deterioration made psychological resilience more difficult to maintain. The recognition that escape was virtually impossible, given the Ork encampment's size and the alien nature of the surrounding territory, created a sense of permanent entrapment that made it difficult to maintain hope or motivation for continued resistance. Survival in Ork captivity required developing adaptation strategies that were fundamentally different from those that might prove effective in human conflicts, approaches that could work within alien psychological frameworks, while preserving whatever remained of human dignity and sanity. The primary adaptation involved accepting that normal human moral frameworks were inadequate for navigating Ork society, requiring a form of moral flexibility that could accommodate actions and choices that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. This adaptation was necessary for survival, but created internal conflicts that persisted long after the immediate threats had ended. Physical adaptation required developing tolerance for various forms of abuse, while learning to minimize actions or behaviors that might attract negative Ork attention. This involved understanding Ork preferences and triggers well enough to avoid provoking violent responses while maintaining sufficient entertainment value to remain useful. Psychological adaptation involved compartmentalizing traumatic experiences to prevent complete mental breakdown while maintaining enough emotional awareness to function effectively in social situations with other prisoners and Ork captors. This compartmentalization was essential for survival but created long-term psychological problems. Social adaptation within the prisoner population required navigating competing survival strategies and conflicting loyalties while building alliances that could provide mutual protection without attracting unwanted Ork attention to successful cooperation between prisoners. The development of useful skills that interested specific Orks provided opportunities for improved treatment and temporary protection, though these skills often involved activities that compromised human moral standards or contributed to Ork military effectiveness. Learning to manage Ork emotions and impulses through entertainment, conversation, or other forms of engagement became crucial for survival, though this manipulation required understanding alien psychology in ways that were fundamentally corrupting to human moral frameworks. Within the Ork encampment, human prisoners served various economic functions that reflected the practical needs of their society while providing opportunities for entertainment and social competition among different Ork groups. Understanding this economic system was essential for identifying opportunities for improved treatment or survival advantages. Labor duties included dangerous construction and maintenance tasks that Orks considered too boring or insufficiently challenging for their own participation. These duties often involved working with hazardous materials, unstable structures, or malfunctioning equipment that created high casualty rates among prisoner workers. The construction projects reflected Ork engineering principles that prioritized immediate functionality over safety or long-term durability, creating work environments that were inherently dangerous even without deliberate attempts to harm prisoners. The combination of alien technology and disregard for safety protocols made every work assignment potentially lethal. Technical consultation involved prisoners with specialized knowledge being forced to assist with maintenance and modification of captured Imperial equipment, though Ork modifications often involved changes that no human engineer would consider advisable or safe. Medical assistance required prisoners with medical training to help treat Ork injuries, though Ork physiology was sufficiently different from human anatomy that such assistance was often ineffective. The failure of human medical knowledge to help Ork patients sometimes resulted in punishment for the prisoner consultants. Entertainment services included various forms of performance, competition, and spectacle that provided amusement for Ork audiences while demonstrating human capabilities and limitations. These entertainment activities often involved risks that made survival a matter of luck rather than skill. Trading commodities involved prisoners being exchanged between different Ork groups based on perceived value or utility, with individual humans serving as currency in negotiations between Ork factions. These trades were conducted without any consideration for prisoner preferences or relationships. The Orks employed psychological warfare techniques that were not systematic or intentional, but rather emerged naturally from their alien psychology and social structures, creating forms of mental torture that were perhaps more effective than deliberate efforts might have been. The unpredictability of Ork behavior created chronic anxiety that made it impossible to develop effective coping strategies or achieve any sense of security. The knowledge that violence could erupt at any moment for reasons that made no sense according to human logic created constant stress that wore down psychological defenses over time. The arbitrary nature of punishment and reward systems made it impossible to learn appropriate behaviors or develop strategies for avoiding negative consequences. Actions that pleased Orks on one occasion might provoke violence on another, creating learned helplessness that gradually eroded self-efficacy and personal agency. The social dynamics among Orks included frequent displays of violence and brutality that served as constant reminders of prisoner vulnerability while demonstrating the futility of resistance. These displays were not directed at prisoners, but were witnessed by prisoners, creating ongoing trauma through observation. The casual dehumanization that characterized Ork treatment of prisoners was perhaps more psychologically damaging than deliberate abuse, as it reduced humans to the status of objects or livestock without the dignity that even torture victims might retain. The cultural activities that incorporated prisoner suffering as entertainment normalized violence and degradation in ways that made it difficult for prisoners to maintain their sense of human dignity or moral worth. Being treated as an entertainment commodity created existential crises that were difficult to resolve. The linguistic and cultural barriers that prevented effective communication with captors created social isolation that compounded the psychological effects of physical captivity, making it impossible to negotiate for better treatment or establish any form of understanding with those who controlled prisoner welfare. The medical treatment of prisoners within the Ork encampment reflected their alien physiology and complete indifference to human welfare, creating healthcare conditions that were often more dangerous than leaving injuries untreated. The Ork pain boys who provided medical services were curious about human anatomy but had no interest in human welfare. Surgical procedures were conducted without anesthesia or sterile conditions, using tools that were designed for Ork physiology rather than human anatomy. These procedures often caused more damage than the original injuries while providing information that satisfied Ork curiosity about human biological systems. Experimental treatments involved testing various Ork medications and procedures on human subjects to determine their effects on alien physiology, with prisoner survival being less important than the generation of useful data about cross-species medical applications. Prosthetic modifications involved replacing damaged human limbs or organs with crude mechanical devices that were designed for Ork use rather than human physiology, creating hybrid creatures that served both practical and entertainment functions within Ork society. Disease management was non-existent, with illnesses spreading unchecked throughout prisoner populations, while Orks remained largely immune due to their superior immune systems. The resulting epidemics created additional casualties while providing opportunities for Orks to study human disease processes. Nutritional management involved feeding prisoners whatever organic matter was available, regardless of its suitability for human consumption. This approach created malnutrition and poisoning issues that were ignored unless they interfered with prisoner utility for work or entertainment. Mental health treatment was not just absent, but actively counterproductive, with Ork attempts to address prisoner psychological problems usually involving violent interventions that created additional trauma while failing to address underlying issues. The relationships that developed between prisoners under Ork captivity were complicated by survival pressures that created conflicts between individual needs and group welfare, making it difficult to maintain the social bonds that might provide psychological support during extreme circumstances. Competition for resources created tensions between prisoners that sometimes erupted into conflicts that served Ork entertainment needs, while destroying the social cohesion that might enable effective resistance or mutual support among captives. The collaboration versus resistance debates that emerged within prisoner populations created moral dilemmas that had no clear resolution, as both approaches involved compromises that violated normal human ethical frameworks while offering uncertain advantages for survival. Leadership dynamics among prisoners were complicated by the fact that traditional military hierarchy was meaningless under alien captivity conditions, while new forms of leadership based on survival skills or Ork favor created conflicts with previous social structures. The formation of alliances and support networks required careful consideration of which relationships might provide mutual benefit without attracting negative Ork attention to successful cooperation between prisoners, making trust and communication extremely difficult to establish. Information sharing about Ork behavior patterns and survival strategies was essential for group survival, but also created security risks if such information fell into Ork hands or was used inappropriately by other prisoners seeking individual advantage. The psychological support systems that developed among prisoners were necessarily limited by the constant threat of separation, death, or punishment that made emotional investment in relationships extremely dangerous for psychological well-being. Extended exposure to Ork society created a form of cultural contamination that affected prisoner psychology in ways that persisted long after physical escape from captivity, alterations to worldview and moral frameworks that could not be easily reversed through normal rehabilitation processes. The normalization of violence that occurred through constant exposure to Ork brutality gradually eroded human sensitivity to suffering and degradation, making it difficult to maintain appropriate emotional responses to situations that should have been deeply disturbing. The adaptation to alien moral frameworks required adopting survival strategies that violated human ethical principles, creating internal conflicts between actions necessary for survival and values that had previously provided meaning and structure to existence. The language acquisition that occurred during captivity included vocabulary and concepts that reflected Ork values and priorities, creating thought patterns that incorporated alien perspectives on violence, dominance, and social relationships. The social skills that developed for managing Ork interactions often involved manipulation, deception, and exploitation techniques that were corrupting to human moral development while being necessary for survival under extreme circumstances. The problem-solving approaches that proved effective in Ork captivity emphasized immediate solutions and violent responses that were inappropriate for normal human social situations but difficult to unlearn after extended practice. The risk assessment capabilities that developed during captivity created permanent hypervigilance and paranoid thinking patterns that were adaptive during imprisonment but became maladaptive in normal social environments. Despite the overwhelming challenges of Ork captivity, some prisoners managed to develop covert resistance networks that provided mutual support and worked toward escape opportunities, though these networks had to operate under conditions that made traditional resistance activities extremely dangerous. Communication systems between prisoners had to account for Ork surveillance capabilities while avoiding detection methods that might result in severe punishment for participants. These communication networks used subtle signals and coded messages that could be transmitted during routine activities. Intelligence gathering about Ork capabilities, schedules, and vulnerabilities required careful observation and analysis while avoiding behavior that might attract unwanted attention from guards or other prisoners who might inform Orks about resistance activities. Sabotage activities were limited to minor disruptions that could be disguised as accidents or incompetence, since obvious sabotage would result in immediate execution of suspected participants along with random prisoners selected as examples. Escape planning required extensive preparation and coordination while maintaining operational security that could withstand Ork interrogation techniques and the constant threat of betrayal by other prisoners seeking individual advantage. The psychological support provided by resistance networks was often more valuable than their practical activities, giving prisoners a sense of agency and purpose that could help maintain mental health and human identity under dehumanizing conditions. Resource acquisition and distribution within resistance networks required careful management to avoid creating obvious disparities in prisoner treatment that might attract Ork attention while ensuring that network members had access to materials needed for continued operations. The development of viable escape plans required understanding Ork security procedures, territorial knowledge, and logistical capabilities while working within the constraints imposed by captivity conditions that made information gathering and resource accumulation extremely difficult. Security analysis involved identifying patterns in guard behavior, shift schedules, and surveillance techniques that might provide opportunities for undetected movement. Though Ork security was often more effective due to their superior physical capabilities rather than sophisticated procedures. Terrain assessment required gathering information about the surrounding environment, including geographical features, weather patterns, and potential hazards that would affect escape attempts, though most of this information had to be gathered through indirect observation. Supply planning involved accumulating basic survival resources while avoiding detection by guards who would punish any prisoner found with unauthorized materials. These supplies had to be hidden in locations that would survive routine searches and prisoner transfers. Route planning required identifying paths that would provide concealment while avoiding areas where Ork patrols or other prisoners might create detection risks. The alien nature of the territory made navigation planning extremely difficult without detailed mapping. Timing coordination involved selecting escape opportunities that would maximize the time before discovery while accounting for factors like weather conditions, Ork activity patterns, and the availability of required resources and personnel. Contingency planning required developing alternative strategies for various failure scenarios, including capture attempts, injury situations, and separation of escape group members during the attempt. The escape opportunity that ultimately proved successful occurred during a period of maximum chaos and minimal security oversight, when Ork attention was focused on external threats rather than prisoner management, creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited by prepared prisoners. The assault preparation created unprecedented confusion within the encampment as different Ork groups competed for roles in the upcoming battle while preparing equipment and personnel for deployment. This competition created conflicts and distractions that reduced attention to prisoner security. Transport loading involved moving prisoners to various vehicles for different purposes during the assault, creating opportunities for prisoners to be separated from their normal guards while being handled by Orks who were unfamiliar with specific prisoner management procedures. The attack on the convoy created immediate tactical priorities that took precedence over prisoner security. with Ork guards focusing on combat effectiveness rather than preventing escape attempts during the ongoing battle. Vehicle destruction created physical opportunities for escape while providing cover and distraction that made immediate pursuit less likely. The chaos of combat made it difficult for Orks to determine which prisoners had been killed and which had escaped. Terrain advantages in the battle area provided concealment opportunities that had not been available within the encampment, while the noise and confusion of combat masked sounds that might otherwise have attracted attention to escaping prisoners. The time factor created by the ongoing battle provided a window of opportunity where escaped prisoners could gain significant distance before Ork attention could be redirected from combat to prisoner recovery operations. The actual escape attempt was characterized by a combination of careful planning and desperate improvisation, as the opportunities created by the chaotic battle situation required immediate responses that could not have been fully anticipated during the planning phase. Breaking restraints required using tools and techniques that had been prepared in advance while adapting to specific circumstances that differed from planning assumptions. The mechanical restraints used by Orks were crude but effective, requiring significant effort and time to overcome. Movement through the battle zone involved navigating between Imperial and Ork forces, while avoiding detection by either side, since Imperial troops might not immediately recognize escaped prisoners as friendly forces rather than potential threats or Ork infiltrators. Terrain navigation required using limited geographical knowledge while making rapid decisions about route selection under conditions where mistakes could result in capture, death, or becoming lost in hostile territory without adequate supplies or equipment. Avoiding pursuit involved understanding Ork tracking capabilities while using environmental conditions and ongoing combat activities to mask signs of passage and confuse potential pursuit efforts. Resource acquisition during escape required finding food, water, and basic equipment while maintaining movement toward Imperial lines, and avoiding areas where such resources might be monitored or trapped by Ork forces. Contact establishment with Imperial forces required convincing them of prisoner identity while avoiding being shot as potential Ork infiltrators or chaos cultists, since extended captivity had created physical and behavioral changes that made recognition difficult. The process of being recovered by Imperial forces involved extensive verification procedures designed to confirm prisoner identity while screening for potential corruption, collaboration, or security risks that might have resulted from extended enemy contact. Identity verification required providing information about military service, personal history, and current events that could confirm legitimate Imperial status while accounting for the psychological and physical changes that extended captivity had created. Medical evaluation revealed the extent of physical damage that months of Ork captivity had inflicted, including injuries, malnutrition, exposure effects, and potential contamination from alien substances or medical procedures. Psychological assessment involved determining mental fitness for continued service while identifying therapeutic needs that would require specialized treatment. The assessment process itself was traumatic, as it required describing captivity experiences in detail. Security debriefing provided intelligence about Ork capabilities, procedures, and vulnerabilities, while ensuring that no classified information had been compromised during captivity. This process was lengthy and sometimes felt like interrogation rather than liberation. Rehabilitation planning involved developing strategies for addressing the physical and psychological damage caused by captivity while determining appropriate roles for continued Imperial service, if such service was still possible. Administrative processing required updating service records, notifying next of kin, and completing various bureaucratic requirements that had accumulated during the period of captivity and presumed death. The recovery process from Ork captivity proved to be more complex and challenging than the initial medical and psychological evaluations had suggested, involving long-term rehabilitation that addressed physical, mental, and social aspects of the trauma experienced during imprisonment. Physical rehabilitation involved treating chronic injuries and medical conditions that had developed during captivity while addressing nutritional deficiencies and exposure effects that had compromised multiple organ systems. The recovery process revealed that some damage was permanent and would require ongoing management. Psychological therapy focused on addressing post-traumatic stress symptoms while helping to rebuild normal emotional responses and social functioning that had been compromised by extended exposure to alien psychology and systematic dehumanization. Social reintegration required learning to interact with normal human society after months of adaptation to alien cultural frameworks. A process that was complicated by the difficulty of explaining captivity experiences to people who had no reference point for understanding such trauma. Vocational assessment involved determining what forms of Imperial service might still be possible given the physical and psychological changes that captivity had created, while accounting for ongoing limitations and therapeutic needs. Family relationships were affected by the changes that captivity had created in personality and psychological functioning, requiring extensive counseling and support to rebuild connections that had been disrupted by the trauma experience. The ongoing monitoring required to ensure continued recovery and identify potential problems created a form of institutional oversight that, while necessary, also served as a constant reminder of the captivity experience and its lasting effects. The most enduring consequence of Ork captivity was the recognition that the experience had created permanent changes to personality, worldview, and psychological functioning that could not be completely reversed through any form of treatment or rehabilitation currently available to Imperial medical services. The hypervigilance that had been necessary for survival during captivity persisted in normal environments, creating ongoing stress and making it difficult to relax or feel secure, even in objectively safe situations. This constant state of alertness was exhausting and interfered with normal social functioning. The moral flexibility that had been essential for navigating Ork society created ongoing confusion about ethical frameworks and appropriate behavior in normal human social situations, making it difficult to make decisions that required moral judgment or ethical reasoning. The survival skills that had been developed during captivity were often inappropriate or counterproductive in normal civilian or military environments, creating social problems and limiting opportunities for meaningful participation in Imperial society. The knowledge gained about Ork society and psychology was valuable for intelligence purposes, but also created ongoing awareness of threats and vulnerabilities that made it difficult to maintain the optimism and hope that enable normal psychological functioning. The relationships that had been formed with other prisoners created ongoing connections and obligations that complicated readjustment to normal social structures, while the loss of prisoners who had died during captivity created survivor guilt that persisted long after physical escape. The physical changes caused by captivity, including scars, disabilities, and chronic medical conditions, served as constant reminders of the experience while affecting self-image and social interactions in ways that complicated the recovery process. This is the reality of survival after Ork captivity, not liberation but transformation, not recovery but adaptation to permanent change, not victory but the recognition that some experiences alter human consciousness in ways that cannot be undone. The price of survival is the knowledge that the person who escaped is not the same person who was captured and never can be again. The war continues, but for those who have seen the true face of the enemy, it is not the same war they once fought. It is a conflict that extends beyond battlefield victory to encompass the preservation of human nature itself against forces that seek not just our defeat, but our transformation into something that no longer deserves the name human.